Uruguay have never won the Rugby World Cup. Uruguay have never made the quarterfinals. They've never secured a 4-try bonus point. They don't even come through qualifying often enough to be considered regulars. And yet, Uruguay have one thing over every other team in this year's World Cup. Because no other nation's rugby traditions have ever been the subject of a 90s survival movie starring Ethan Hawke. On Friday the 13th of October 1972, Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 crashed into a glacier on the Andes. On board were members of Old Christians RFC, a rugby team scheduled to play a match in Chile the next day. The story has become synonymous with rugby in Uruguay for the sheer spirit of those who did survive, to band together and to resort to cannibalism. This story lurked behind rugby in Uruguay for years until, in 1993, it was adapted into an inspirational true story type picture with a cast of actors that you know you like, but you still need to look up on IMDb every time you see them. However, there's far more to rugby in Uruguay than Ethan Hawke ever made a movie about. And so, with them having qualified for Japan this year, it's time to cover some of the things you should know about Uruguayan rugby before sunrise in the land of the rising sun. In a twist very few will be expecting, rugby was introduced to Uruguay by British and Irish settlers teaching the sport in schools. From an initial select few, it spread to more and more institutions across the country. The same settlers also tried to introduce cricket to Uruguay, but for reasons no one quite understands, they found that boring and stuck to rugby instead. Rugby, however, struggled to grow beyond schools, to be taken seriously as a game for adults, until a man by the name of Carlos Cat, who amazingly was a Uruguayan politician, not a character in Animal Crossing, took a series of government positions in social affairs and pushed existing sports clubs to start rugby teams. This led to a modern day where the final of the Uruguayan League last year was between a cricket team and a polo club. And even once Cat was out the cradle, this link to politics continues. Rugby in Uruguay is reasonably well funded thanks to holding a place as the game of the elite, multiple former cabinet members having served as chairman of the Uruguayan Rugby Union, and the brother of a former president even winning 2 caps whilst his sibling was in office. The national team itself, however, has a slightly more floundering history. Known as Los Terros after the southern lorping, the national bird of Uruguay, which is apparently a thing that countries have, Uruguay have kinda stayed in their own lane ever since their test debut in 1948. There's never been any crisis, any regression, but there just aren't many glory tapes to show. Uruguay have never beaten a Tier 1 team, racking up 42 straight losses against Argentina alone. They do, however, have a couple of prestigious scalps to their name, including 2 wins over Georgia and 1 over Japan. However, beyond survival movies, they have another thing over fellow outsiders Namibia and Russia, in that Uruguay do actually have a couple of World Cup wins to their name, beating Spain in 1999 and in Georgia in 2003. Now, it's impossible to talk about Uruguay's run in those World Cups without mentioning a man by the name of Diego Ormaechea. A legend of Los Terros, Ormaechea won his first cap in the 70s and yet went on to be the man to score Uruguay's first ever World Cup try in 1999. 79 caps over a 20-year career. Ormaechea still holds the record for most test tries by any forward, and now works as one of South America's most prestigious sports surgeons, because of course he does. And since, both his sons have actually gone on to play for Uruguay. Juan, a hard-hitting flanker, is still in the side, and Augustin, the small sheep of the family, a nippy, cheeky halfback who was possibly his country's standout at the 2015 World Cup, and the scorer of one of their 2 tries. However, whilst he's still in and around the squad, in more recent times, Ormaechea has lost his starting shirt to who I view as perhaps the most exciting player in Uruguayan rugby right now, 22-year-old Santiago Arata. Arata has played all across the backline, even capped on the wing and at fullback, but it's at scrum half where he looks the most settled, even if he doesn't really like to sit still. Arata has a knack for noticing napping, and is as good as they get at exploiting lapses in defences. He's very, very quick, and has the speed of thought to match his speed of feet. He has an occasional tendency to do, should we say, silly things, but if he can stick to what he does best, he'll be the main man for Fiji and Georgia to keep an eye on. Now, another personal favourite of mine is Arata's likely halfback partner, Felipe Bercegi. Bercegi is a smart, talented fly half, but my real fascination with Felipe comes for other reasons. Simply put, Bercegi is one of us. He's a rugby nerd dropped into a Rugby World Cup. He's claimed in the past that he just watches rugby obsessively, that he's a massive fan of the pro game in Europe, Africa, Australasia, around the world. And in 2015, he got a chance to play against his heroes in rugby's biggest showpiece, becoming an avatar for fans everywhere, living our dreams in his waking life. When given the chance to play against Wales in the packed Millennium Stadium with the roof shut, Bercegi cried. After 80 minutes opposite Quade Cooper, Bercegi asked him him for his autograph. He's a very calm player on the pitch and a very dedicated one on training days, but there's a rare, warm burst of energy about him off the field. There's a pretty exciting prospect either side of games in Japan. Other players to watch include captain and magnificent seven Juan Manuel Gaminara, centre Joaquin Prada, who picks an angle like a human protractor, hard-nosed prop Matteo Sanguinetti, and a pair of very experienced backs, both presently at the Toronto Arrows. Leandro Levias, a winger who is behind Oniel Machea as Uruguay's all-time top try scorer, and Gaston Mieres, a well-balanced fullback who can play basically anywhere across the backline. Now, Uruguay's qualification last time out in 2015 was borderline miraculous, beating the more fancied Russia to squeak into the final spot. When they arrived, however, they discovered that reality bites, losing every game by at least 40 points. But like Baseji, the URU really took the positives out of the experience and have since done a great deal to improve Uruguay off the pitch. The money made from 2015 has been pumped into the system. Uruguay refurbished their development pathway, and this has seen them turn players in their boyhood into senior players like Arata, and then further funding has gone into getting those already developed into full-time environments. Last time out, Uruguay were the only team with more amateur players in their 31 than professionals, but the advent of Major League Rugby has allowed so many more of their players to go pro. 12 of their team now play across the fast food nation, and funding for their qualification for 2019 has allowed them to already sign 15 further players to professional deals with the union, meaning virtually their entire squad in Japan will be actual full-time rugby players rather than horse surgeons only there for the time off work. And whilst they did perhaps look somewhat error-strewn in this year's America's Rugby Championship, struggling against teams they perhaps should have put away more comprehensively, there has been a general upwards curve in performance since 2015. Uruguay beat Canada twice in qualifying to take the second American slot, then last year beat Romania in Romania, and the year before Namibia in Namibia. They've had some slip-ups along the way, but Uruguay are improving at a rate at least on par with, but often above any other Tier 2 nation, and they should pose far more of a challenge this time round than they did in 2015. Whether or not this will result in an upset remains to be seen, but if they do, it'll be an underdog story so inspirational you can bet your bottom peso that Ethan Hawke will be on the phone asking to option, ready to give them one more thing over every other team in this year's World Cup. Oh, you watched this one all the way to the end. Thank you. It's really lovely of you. Thank you. I don't mean to be sarcastic. I know it sounds like that. I genuinely mean it. And thank you to everyone that supports us on Patreon as well. All of you whose names are floating up down the side, unless the video credits are still on. Thank you very much. This is part 11 in an ongoing series on every team in this year's Rugby World Cup. That means we're halfway now. However, part 10, which came out last week, the one on Canada, had actually just a quick factual error. At one point, I said that women's rugby in Canada is reasonably well funded for women's rugby. It turns out, this is correct by Jess Nielsen on Twitter, this is very much not the case. And in fact, as she pointed out, and a couple of people have since chimed in on as well, women's players in Canada are often having to pay what amounts to thousands of Canadian dollars to play for the country a year almost. In order to train, in order to play themselves, they're covering their own expenses. At which point I was also sent to, there's a fund, however, set up in order to help these players be able to afford to represent their country in order to go out and do what they're doing. And it makes just what Canada have achieved of being amongst the best women's sides in the world all the more impressive. It's the Canadian Rugby Fund, and there is a link in the description if you want to help women's players in Canada be able to just travel to games, just be able to actually make it, to give them the chance to represent their country, because it's getting to a point in which it's almost pay to play, and if you can't afford to, then you can't, no matter how talented you are, hit that standard and play at the highest level. So it'd be enormously appreciated on behalf of myself, and I presume Canadian Women's Rugby, if you could do so. So thank you very much. Thank you again for watching the video, and there'll be another one next week on another team in the World Cup of people hitting each other that's coming up later this year.